for those of you who are looking for the free content to advertise what is in our vault, we will have another edition of Back to the Territories. This one focusing on Georgia with somebody who booked Georgia and worked Georgia under the hood of the Masked Superstar was Bill Eadie. And my memory of this show, other than being a huge Bill Eadie mark, I wanted the mask on the set somehow. And obviously I didn't want Bill to wear the damn thing for the 2-hour interview. So I got a foam head. My wife is active in the theater. So from her theater company, I got a foam head that they used to keep wigs on. And we mounted it on a tripod that we weren't a lighting tripod, not a camera tripod, a lighting tripod. Screwed the foam head, and the hood sat behind Bill on that for the entire show. People like the little minutia like that, so there you go.
Let's see.
I love that series, the Back to the Territories series.
Oh, that's such an incredible series.
Yeah, I think Rock is stealing it now for TV, right?
Well, he's doing a documentary version of it. So the Dark Side of the Ring people, he's doing Dark Side of the Territories.
Okay.
So he's not stealing the sit-down interview format. I don't know how you could steal that.
Right.
Actually, here's a question, just, Steve from North Hollywood. Would you have any consideration of reviving the Back to the Territories series without Jim Cornette? Or is that something that would live and die with him?
I don't know that I'd want anyone else to do it. He was just incredible. It was made for him. We constructed the series for him. When he called me exasperated from a booking he had just had from a shoot company and said, "Can you put me on a fucking retainer or something so I only work for you and I don't have to deal?" I said, "Jim, goddamn, I don't have enough work to justify keep you on a monthly retainer." I said, "But why don't we do this? Well, why don't we put our heads together and come up with a series that is yours? You can host. We can do whatever, 6 of them or 5 of them a year or whatever we were doing, and we'll write it together. We'll post it." But you can construct the interview. You can choose the guest with us, approve the guest, and it'll be Back to the Territories with Jim Cornette. It'll be your show. So I would keep that his. I can't imagine another person that would have done it as entertainingly and historically accurate and informative as Jim did. I wouldn't want anybody else. I'd bring Jim back to do it.
Professional wrestling was a staple of the Georgia sports fans' diet from the early years of the 20th century, but it gained in popularity after pioneer pro wrestler Paul Jones established the ABC booking office in Atlanta in 1944. The advent of television in the Peach State in the early 1950s accelerated the sport's growth, and national stars began headlining events alongside Southern legends like Herb Welch, Buddy Fuller, and others. Fred Blassie had a long and successful run as the man in Georgia, the star you love to hate. By the 1960s, Live Atlanta Wrestling, hosted by Ed Capral, was a ratings hit broadcast from the studios of WAII-11 in Atlanta, and the program was syndicated to other markets in the state like Savannah and Augusta. Weekly live events at the historic Atlanta City Auditorium became an institution, and sellouts were frequent. Additionally, Columbus, Georgia-based promoter Fred Ward, a minority shareholder in the ABC office, produced his own TV program for Columbus and Macon, and ran weekly events there and throughout South Georgia. Top wrestlers seeing action in Georgia in the 1960s included Haystacks Calhoun, Gorgeous George, Dick the Bruiser, Dr. Jerry Graham, Argentina Rocca, Eddie Graham, Sputnik Monroe, Mario Galinto, Bob Orton Sr., Doug the Professional Gilbert, Buddy Colt, Bobby Shane, and a young babyface named Nick Bockwinkel. Tag team wrestling was incredibly popular in Georgia as well, with teams like Grizzly Smith and Luke Brown, the Kentuckians, or the Torres brothers, Alberto, Enrique, and Raymond, waging long wars with heel duos like the Von Brauners with manager Saul Weingeroff, the Masked Infernos with J.C. Dykes, the original Anderson brothers, Gene and Lars, and Georgia's all-time top heel team, Jody Hamilton and Tom Renesto, the Masked Assassins. The NWA World Heavyweight Championship was defended often in the state by every champion of the decade, including Lou Thez, Gene Kiniski, and Dory Funk Jr. But in a talent-filled territory, one man stood head and shoulders above the rest, Ray Gunkel. Gunkel, a former amateur wrestling great, had debuted in Georgia as the 1950s closed, and for the majority of the next dozen years, he reigned as not only the most popular local babyface, but eventually the booker and part owner of the ABC booking office. Until tragedy struck on August 1st, 1972. Gunkel died of a heart attack in the locker room of the Savannah Civic Center following a match with Ox Baker. He was 48. A meeting was held of the ABC owners, including Jones, Ward, Southern wrestling legend Lester Welch, and Gunkel's widow, Ann, a former fashion model. The others offered Ann Gunkel what they wanted to pay her to buy out Ray's shares, and she refused it. So they folded the existing company and opened a new one without her. But Ann Gunkel wasn't done. She appealed to the owner of WTCG 17, the small Atlanta independent station now carrying the wrestling program, an Atlanta entrepreneur named Ted Turner. He gave her fledgling promotion, All South Wrestling, an hour of time adjacent to the new Georgia Championship Wrestling program, creating a 2-hour block. Then, in one fell swoop, she convinced every wrestler on the Georgia roster save two, Bob Armstrong and Darrell Cochran, to join her new company. The National Wrestling Alliance was horrified at this unprecedented raid on one of their member territories. Beginning the following Friday night, November 24th, 1972, NWA promoters began sending their top talent to Atlanta every weekend to fight the war. From Florida came Jack Briscoe, Hiro Matsuda, the NWA champion Dory Funk Jr., and Eddie Graham himself. From Tennessee came Lester Welch's family members, Buddy, Ron, and Robert Fuller, and Roy Lee Welch. From Detroit came Bobo Brazil and later the Sheik himself. Florida announcer Gordon Soley became the new host of the TV show. Graham installed his protege Bill Watts as booker and arranged for the return of Georgia favorite Mr. Wrestling Tim Woods. Johnny Rubberman Walker returned as the masked Mr. Wrestling too. But even in the face of all that star power, All South Wrestling, with all the local favorites, persevered. Finally, the NWA convinced Jim Barnett, one of the most powerful behind-the-scenes forces in the sport's history, to return to the States from Australia, where he had spent the previous decade running the biggest promotion in the world, a company he called WCW, World Championship Wrestling. Barnett used his political connections, powers of persuasion, and ruthless business practices to finally end the war in the NWA's favor. Georgia Championship Wrestling was once again the only game in town, with weekly events at the City Auditorium and regular major cards held at the new Atlanta Omni, the largest, most modern arena in the South. The 2-hour Saturday evening block on WTCG remained, as the station was just a few years away from being beamed by satellite to every cable system in the country and being renamed WTBS, the Turner Broadcasting System, and caused the Atlanta fans to grow accustomed to the biggest stars in the sport appearing on their weekly events live and in person. Wrestling in the Peach State of Georgia was at an all-time high. Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another exciting episode of Back to the Territories from Kayfabe Commentaries. I'm Jim Cornette, and once again, we're hopping in the DeLorean, and we're taking a trip back in time. And the trip we're taking today is to a place that I know well, and so does our guest, Georgia Championship Wrestling. And with me, he's been a Mongolian, he's been a demolition expert, but for the purposes of this exercise, the masked superstar, Bill Eadie. Bill, thank you very much for being here.
Good to see you, my friend.
And we were talking before we just went on the air, you actually had 2 runs in Georgia for the 2 different promotions that we have talked about in the history piece. You were one of the Mongols for All South, and then later the masked superstar in Georgia Championship Wrestling. What was it like actually being there as part of the most famous wrestling war in modern wrestling history?
Well, you know, I was in the middle of it, and I didn't know I was in a war. It was funny because I was just a green guy beating up people, hurting people, I'm sure. And I was tagged with a crafty old veteran, Guido Mongol. And we were going down to Georgia. That sounds like a song, doesn't it?
Yeah, you devil.
We were
you
going
devil,
down
you.
to Georgia weekly. And I thought it was great. We'd fly down. We'd catch a flight from Pittsburgh. I was living in Ohio at the time, and Guido was former promoter of Pittsburgh. So we'd go down every week, and they ran, the group that we ran with was Gunkel's group, and we'd do Tuesday nights. And then we'd fly back on Wednesday morning. And I was making those trips for about 2 years, not knowing eventually I'd end up living and working and making my living right out of Georgia.
And you're home for 30 years, right?
My home,
Atlanta,
yeah, I still live in Atlanta. But it was exciting because it was new to me. And, going all over those names, it just brought back so many memories that in events that took place and how exciting it was, because at that time you had 2 promotions running a major city, Atlanta, every Tuesday and every Friday, and selling out.
Yeah.
And everybody around the country that was in wrestling, all the top guys and all the underneath guys, all wanted to go there.
Well, what explain the TV situation, because this is what was really interesting to me when we were talking earlier, in that Channel 17 was broadcasting both shows. It became the modern 2-hour Saturday night 6 o'clock wrestling block, but at the time it was 2 separate programs, and they were taped at the same, one right after another on the same day in the same location.
Same studio, Saturday mornings. Our group would tape first, so Ann Gunkel's crew members would set up the ring. And then Barnett's would do the hour, and the ring would still stay up. Turner was producing both shows, and Barnett's group would have their hour, and they'd tear the ring down. And we're going through the studio and going through the dressing room saying, hey, how you doing, blah, blah, blah. I'm meeting new faces. They're saying old stories to old guys. And it was goofy but fun.
Was there heat? Because I know, like, for example, when Jerry Jarrett's group in Memphis was in a war with the Paphos ICW, there was heat. There was outside the ring confrontations. People were pulling guns, carrying weapons. Was there heat amongst the crews, or was it all confined to the offices?
I think there was a little bit of heat between certain individuals who thought that they were supposed to be the top stars of the whole world.
Yeah.
But they were the top stars of one company. And then we had top stars at our company who thought they were top stars of the whole world. But the boys are the boys, I guess there was heat between the promoters, but I only heard of Barnett, and I hadn't met Watts at that time. I knew Gunkel. I knew she was giving me my money and my pay, and she was very nice to me. So I guess I was an outlaw, but I didn't know I was an outlaw.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and it was such an odd situation, because normally any outlaw promotion in a war is going to bring in outside talent that had not been there, but so many of the guys that were household names in Georgia went with her because of the respect they had for Ray Gunkel, and conversely, possibly the heat the rest of the office had with a lot of the guys.
Yeah.
So you had come in from outside, but she had a lot of Georgia-based wrestlers there, and the established promotion was the one that was bringing guys in from all over the country to try to fight it. So it was almost like a mirror image of a regular wrestling war.
At that point, we heard all of this information and all these guys. And of course, I was, like I said, I was young and I was just listening to Guido, but Guido knew all these guys. But you're right, they were bringing in so many new faces that they looked like the outlaw group trying to invade Georgia. And I think that the Gunkel and his wife had established good relationships with people in the past.
Yeah.
And that's hard to do in the wrestling business. And I guess they returned the favors because they respected her husband.
What, if you were privy to it, or if you knew at the time, what was it Barnett was the difference maker? What led, because they were both selling out for so long, and business was strong, but then finally the NWA office got the upper hand. Was it Barnett and his manipulations? Was it just they couldn't keep a steady stream of talent going against this onslaught of stars from all over the country? What was the tipping point?
Well, I really can't tell you the tipping point. I knew that the crowd started declining somewhat. And I think, like in all tipping points, the tipping point was money.
Yeah.
Barnett had a lot more money, or had access to a lot more money, and could make better payoffs. And like Ted DiBiase said, everybody has their price. And I know a lot of people were transitioning, and we were making a move at that time to go with IWA, Eddie Einhorn.
Boy, you were just an outlaw all over the place.
I didn't know it. I mean, Guido, I guess, was one of the ringleaders of the outlaw conspiracy group, and I was just following him, but I got a good experience out of it.
He was a friend, by the way, of my old friend Brian Hildebrand, Mark Curtis, the referee, and he always spoke so highly of Guido and trained with him in Pittsburgh there for a while. And when you went to, you say you were going to the IWA at one point in the mid-'70s was running a variety of locations. Was that the IWA Carolinas, the IWA the Northeast?
It was
on that big Roosevelt Stadium?
Yeah, we were on we were the original national
there you go,
IWA.
yeah.
And then, of course, TBS did the same thing, took off. And then Vince later on did the same thing and took off.
At the time, Eddie Einhorn was bankrolling the IWA.
It was the old, it became ESPN, but I forget what they had called it at the time. But he
had been revolutionary also in college sports, in syndicating college sports before that was a big thing, and there was no network coverage of college ball.
Right. And he had some good ideas. I mean, he wasn't just for making money himself. He was going to designate certain guys to work certain territories, and your area would be Louisville, in that area. You'd run, and he'd give you 3 or 4 shows a year out of there. And mine would have been maybe the Columbus, Ohio area, and Guido's was Pittsburgh. Everybody that took the step with him, took that gamble, he was going to reward you, and he was going to set up a retirement program. It's unheard of, right?
That sounds way too logical.
Yes.
Way too logical. And of course, history's shown Vince in the Northeast shut him out of a lot of the buildings.
Mm-hmm.
The promoters had that power back in those days, and they tried to go down to the Carolinas, which was a wrestling hotbed, but Crockett was so entrenched there.
Right. And we did well in certain areas. Winston-Salem was the headquarters.
Yeah.
But, you can't fight City Hall some places.
Especially in North Carolina.
Yeah.
It's not done.
No.
So what happened when you transitioned from being one of the Mongols to the mass superstar? It happened, I know, in the Carolinas, but how did it come about? How did you get the shot to go in? How did George Scott present, the booker there at the time, present the superstar gimmick to you?
Well, Guido and I had left the IWA, and George had invited us to come in and work for the Carolinas, Mid-Atlantic. And we did a series of programs with some different guys, and ended up with the culmination being Mongols against the Andersons. And we did that for about 6 months. Well, in the interim period, Guido was actually wanting to go home. And George Scott had approached me, and he says, I got an idea, and I need to get an answer from you. And I think he was having some trouble with Jardine. I don't know what it was about. The spoiler, who was there, and one of their top players at the time.
Yeah.
And I never delved into it. It wasn't any of my business, but I assume it was over money. It always is. So Jardine left, and George Scott approached me with the idea of going under a mask. Well, I owed loyalty to Guido, and I said, Guido, George has asked me to do this. He said, go ahead, do it. I'm going to go home anyway. He says, I've been trying to figure out a way to tell you. He says, we're going to have a series of matches with the Andersons. Right after that, you can become a mass superstar. So I talked to my wife about it. My wife's grandmother made all my masks, made my capes, my outfits. I ordered boots. And Boris Malenko, he was in the territory at the time, and he wasn't my manager at the time, but he was going to be. So he and I went to Park Center in Charlotte every Monday. They had matches in the evening. We'd go down there in the morning, and we'd just practice holds and counters. And, you know, and I taught school before, so I wasn't worried about my interviews. And Guido had given me a good foundation. When I first broke into the business, he taught me all the babyface moves. When I became one of the Mongols, I became a specialist. Eyes, ears, nose, and throat. So I didn't have to do anything. So all I had to do was go over these moves. In about 6 weeks, he said, I think we're ready. We had a loser leave town match, Bolo Mongol, against Wahoo McDaniel in the Greensboro Coliseum. He beat me, and the stipulation was I would take his feathers, he would leave town, or he would cut my ponytail and I would leave town. I lost, got my ponytail cut on Sunday. Monday, I've got a new vehicle that I bought 4 or 5 weeks before that.
Because the fans couldn't see you driving the same car.
Never drove it. I had a Ford before, and I bought a new Dodge van. So I drove the Ford to Greensboro. The next day, my wife driving the Ford around, and I drove a Dodge van with a mask to Greenville, South Carolina.
Monday night.
Monday night, and I wrestled as the masked superstar.
You know, I was looking at the records of the Georgia territory and the Carolinas are adjacent.
Oh, yeah.
They butt up against each other, but during the war from 72 to 74, all the NWA talent was coming in, but not that much from the Carolinas. And possibly it was because they were gearing up to fight their own opposition with the IWA up there. But then towards 75 and 76, once that Barnett had taken control, Ann Gunkel was out, he was the only game in town, then guys started coming down from Charlotte. It took the superstar a little while, but I wanted to get just the names. This is an example of an Omni card, May 23rd, 1975. NWA Championship, Jack Briscoe versus Dory Funk Jr., Andre the Giant and Mr. Wrestling 2 against Abdullah the Butcher and the Sheik, Mr. Wrestling, Tim Woods against Harley Race, Jerry Lawler against Jerry Briscoe, and 3 more matches. That was the cream of the crop.
And those
at the time.
3 more matches would probably be
and they were stars.
They would have been main event guys, yeah.
You know, that was the cream of the crop of the NWA at that time. And 1975 was the year that Dusty Rhodes made his debut. Eddie Graham always took an interest in Georgia business, had sent Gordon Soley up, had really been a help. Was it still due to the influence, I know it's money also, and the Omni was a huge building, but the influence that Jim Barnett had not only with talent, but more importantly with promoters across the country. He had been in the business at that time for 25 years. He knew everybody.
Yeah, I think he had developed good relationship with all of those guys, and they respected Jim. I respected Jim. I mean, we had conversations a number of times, and there was a guy that if you pinned him down and he gave you his word was gold.
Yeah.
There are very few people that
you had to get it, right? You had to get the word.
Yes, exactly. I mean, there's very few people that would things that are done on a verbal agreement or a handshake, and he was one of them. Inoki was another. Vince McMahon Sr. was another one. And you learn that, well, these guys have some scruples. A lot of people say this or that or this, that, but you only have to deal with how they handle with you, because everybody's got a story. So
Barnett was such a character. Tell some locker room stories about just he loved to have meetings with the guys.
Oh my
right?
goodness! Yeah.
My boys. Any news? Any scoops? Any dirt?
Well, he was upset with me one time because I think we got along real well, and he would call my wife when I was overseas and have a conversation with her, just chit chat. And I had made an arrangement to go back. George Scott had been asking. I was only supposed to go to Georgia for about a 6 weeks period, and ended up there for about a year and a half and loved it.
Yeah.
And George would keep calling me, Bill, you got to. Well, we're in the middle of this, we're in the middle of that. So it stretched it out to about 2 years, but then I finally, because George gave me my break.
Yeah.
So I told him, I said, okay, I'll start and I'll talk to Jim. So it was one of the meetings. And I told him that he was talking about this and that and this and that we're doing. And I said, Jim, he says, anybody have any questions or any answers? I said, Jim, I hate to do this, but I just wanted to make sure that you knew I wasn't going to be here about during when we're talking about what we're going to do. One, my boy, I don't. You don't give me your notice. I give notices. And he got over it, but I mean, he was just taken aback that
He wasn't used to it.
And he did treat me good, and I felt bad about it. And I told him, I said, it's only going to be for a short period of time. He says, well, you were only supposed to be here for a short period of time.
Jerry Jarrett told me a story one time. He when he was booking down there, he did a pretty good impersonation, as a lot of people do. My boy of Jim Z. That's how I got my middle initial, by the way, James E. Cornette, because Jim Cornette and Jim Barnett were so similar.
Oh, yeah.
When I was first on the booking sheet in Georgia, they said, "Oh, Jim Z's on the card," you know, and that's it. But Jerry Jarrett's Jim's not there one night, and so Jerry Jarrett goes in and he's doing Jim, and he sits down on the. He has that distinctive walk, and he sits down on the edge of the table.
On the edge of the table, yeah.
And now, boys, Robert Fuller is going to give us our arena rat report. Robert? And Robert said, well, Sally's here tonight, and that's going to make the boys awful happy, and so, and then somebody else would do it, and whatever. And all of a sudden, Jerry noticed the guy starting to walk away from him, and he's still doing his bit, and he thinks he's flopping, right? And he turns, and there's Barnett standing behind him. Very good, Jerry. You know?
I think he had a good sense of humor. I think that he was very instrumental in this business, you know. For the people to remember him and the boys remember him this long after his passing is something. It's a positive note.
Well, among the other things, he invented studio wrestling in Indianapolis when he owned owned majority and manipulated at least one of the largest territories in the country in the 50s, the big Midwest, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Kentucky. He's the one who set Roy Shire up with the TV in San Francisco and allowed Roy, his booker from Indianapolis, to take his top star, Ray Stevens, and go out to San Francisco and made it the biggest drawn city in the country. He had such political connections. He was on the National Council of the Arts. He could get President Carter on the phone in Georgia when he wanted to. So, you know, he had just that ability to make connections and had political pull that he could get things done. He could get people TVs or he could get sponsors. That's how he ended up with the airline in Australia was sponsoring World Championship Wrestling, and they paid better than any promotion in the world at that time.
And had a lot of top guys in and out of there for years and years. One of the big drawbacks is when he tried to do the same thing in Japan and he ran up against the wrong guys.
Yeah, well, Japan was a little more closed society. But you mentioned the Anderson brothers. You worked with the Andersons in the Carolinas. The new Anderson brothers, not Lars and Gene, but Ole and Gene, were working the Carolinas and started in Georgia by about 76. And so the guys had to be coming back to the Carolinas saying, hey, the Omni's beautiful and this short trip territory was your interest piqued?
Well, you know, like I said, George Scott gave me my chance. I often tell the story. I was young, green, didn't know much about the business, knew I was hurting some people, but I was told to just be as aggressive as possible. Yeah. But I was smart enough to realize that if George Scott, who was the booker, gave me the character, liked the character, he was going to push the character, and I was going to make some money. So I could have stayed in the Carolinas forever. I loved it. Until I got to Georgia, and you know, in the Carolinas, it was almost as bad as Oklahoma. Not quite as bad, but you know, you're going 300 miles, 250, 280, this. Well,
the double Charleston rib, when you had to go from Charleston, South Carolina to Charleston, West Virginia.
I thought we did something bad. Yeah. Because we had Charleston, Richmond, Savannah, Norfolk. For about 3 or 4 weeks, Paul Jones and I'm thinking, Paul, do you know something that we did that we wasn't supposed to do?
Who do we apologize to, right?
But then I went to Atlanta, and Monday night was Augusta, 140 miles. Tuesday, I believe, was Macon, 70 miles. Wednesday, Columbus, 100 miles. Thursday was Rome, 60 miles. Friday was downtown. Saturday was a rough day. It was TV in the morning, rush to get in the car, speed to get to Columbus, do TV, and then a spot show that night was always home. And Sunday was Marietta, 12 miles.
12 miles, yeah.
And after a while, I was telling somebody at an interview a couple weeks ago, I was home 5 to 6 nights a week watching the 11 o'clock news.
Yeah.
That never happened.
Well, Georgia, living in Atlanta, you were centrally located, and the towns weren't that far away. And at the time, Chattanooga maybe was 2 hours. If
100 miles.
At that point, when Nick Gulas had folded up and Jerry Jarrett didn't take it over, so they folded that into the Georgia territory. But everything was 2 hours or less each way, and you could literally, you didn't have to be in a hotel unless you wanted to be.
Yeah.
You know, and we were one of the
Well,
guys
the furthest town when I first moved there was Savannah. That was 250 miles. Yeah. Well, fortunately or unfortunately, it didn't do very well, and the Carolinas took it over.
Yeah, Crockett picked it up, and then we had to go all the way down there. You know, if it wasn't bad enough. Yeah. But you finally, you were in the Carolinas for that big run and finally made your Atlanta debut in 1978. And at the roster, just once again, the names that year that were being pushed in Georgia: Babyfaces, Dusty Rhodes, Tommy Wildfire Rich, Tony Atlas, Mr. Wrestling 2, Thunderbolt Patterson. On the heel side was Ole and Gene the Andersons, Stan Hansen, Abdullah the Butcher, Ivan Koloff, Ric Flair had just started. Both WWF champion Superstar Billy Graham and AWA champion Nick Bockwinkel and Andre the Giant were coming in and out.
Oh yeah.
It was a gathering point for all the top stars in the country, and once again the political manifestations and manipulations of getting Graham to defend his title or Nick to defend his title in an NWA city, Barnett had to be the only guy who could pull that off.
Yeah. And, you know, they had a show place. The Omni was the place to be. It was probably the Gardens of the South.
Yeah.
You know, of course, Charlotte had some big buildings in Greensboro and Charlotte and stuff like that, but Atlanta was the place to be in the South. Yep. Of course, you had New Orleans and some other places, but you know, anybody that was anybody at that time, and that was the beginning of guys coming from New York into Atlanta. They didn't last very long because it was, it was a different style of wrestling, and you know that being in the Southern business all your career. It's a different style. It's a harder, faster pace. Some territories you can slow down and do less and be accepted. Not down south, man. You had to move.
Well, a guy like Ivan Koloff, who was a beast anyway, who just and always in shape, he could go.
Yeah.
He could change his style. Billy Graham, maybe not so much because he relied so much on the promo and the show and the body.
Right.
And
right.
I remember when he came to Tennessee after his run up there had been over with, and we had seen the magazines. This was before videotape, so we'd seen the magazines and the pictures and all the publicity. And we love Billy as a person, but it just didn't translate.
Well, you know, one of the things that I think is a big factor, if you're in the South, you're in one town Monday, next Monday you're there.
Yeah.
The next Monday you're there.
They're going to see
the
you all
next
the time.
Monday you're there 52 times a year. Well, in New York or some of the other territories, you might only be in New York 5-6 times a year. 3 of those shows you might not be on it. You might be in Philly or you might be in Washington. So, boy, in the South, you had to be up every night because next week you're going to be there again.
And there had to be something going on in the match too, because you were probably going to wrestle the same guy the next week.
Yeah.
Programs in those days in the Southern weekly territories would go on 10,
Months.
12, 15 weeks, whatever the case, and you might get away from it, but you'd come back to it. So there always had to be something fresh, some new twist, some new stipulation. It wasn't that way in the Northeast because a monthly town at best, and you weren't there every time, as you said. But
well, up north, you would, especially for the champion, maybe it was Bruno, heel, loss. Boom, boom, boom. Three match. Maybe if you're really good, you got a 4th match.
I think Pat Patterson got 4. I think he's maybe the only one ever.
But in the South, you might be going for 5 or 6 months, and you know this.
Yeah.
And you have that last match, but it's really not settled because there's something that you're going to come back to. Maybe it's 6 months from now. You know, we haven't finished our business yet.
Yeah.
And in the people's eyes, you really didn't, because we didn't see the guy get 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
Up there was different. Whether they brought in George Steele or whoever it was, he had his first match, was disqualification, whatever, double count out, and then boom, he lost. Same thing with everybody.
Well, that's also the same reason that, to me, the Northeast was all about the babyface champion turning back the heel, whereas in the South it was mostly the heel champion with heat turning back, foiling the babyface, because the people would pay to see the match, however long it took until the babyface got even.
Exactly.
Then he'd win the belt and he'd keep it long enough so that you didn't lose faith in him, and then somebody else would screw him.
Yeah.
And off you go to the races again. You've mentioned the schedule earlier of Georgia. For example, if Friday night you were either at the Omni or the City Auditorium, you get up the next morning, go over to Channel 17, tape the TV show.
Early in the morning.
And what was it like? Explain to the people going into a TV, literally an operating TV station where they did the news and whatever else at like 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock on Saturday morning with this giant crew of wrestlers setting up a ring, and here we go, and we have these matches, and the looks you would get sometimes from some of the crew.
Well, they would try to set up a halfway dressing area, but you're in cubicles if somebody's working next to you, and then maybe there's 5 or 6 empty cubicles, and there's 300-pound wrestler here, and there's a guy over here, and these poor people are trying to do their work, and there's no room for anybody. There's boots all over the place. Some guys don't wash their gear.
Yeah.
You've seen those guys. It's been in the bag for a week in the back of the truck. That opens up, and everything flies out of it. And then, of course, the bookers, they have a little conference room. And then you only have a small studio. I mean, it's not like you have a giant-sized studio.
It was like 80 people, 100 people tops.
And it's the same studio that you see during the news and the sports and the weather, and they're all over in the corner, and they're shooting on this side. But it was accepted. It was accepted.
When the Rock and Roll Express was on Atlanta TV, I noticed a lot of the female employees would have to be walking through that area because of something they forgot. Trying to find Robert Gibson in flagrante delicto, as they say.
Yeah.
Then you jump in a car and you badass down to Columbus, because Fred Ward, I never got a chance to do. They were not doing that TV by the time I got there. What was doing
that
the
was
Columbus
live
TV like?
That was live TV. Fortunately, in the morning, it was 2 hours of tape TV that showed, I think it was 6 to 8 or something in the evening. But then you had to really scoot 100 miles, and all the police got used to the wrestlers coming down, and they'd wait. They'd be like they're fishing on a corner. They hook you once in a while, and then they were paying tickets by cash. It's not like today. But then you'd scoot in there and you'd do an hour of live TV in a small studio again, not air conditioned. And as soon as you finished that, you'd try to find a burger or something to eat to get back up north to make one of the 2 or 3 house shows.
Because Fred Ward's and his son-in-law, Ralph Freed, Rooster, their towns were on Tuesday and Wednesday.
Yes.
And occasionally they'd have a spot show on a weekend, but more often you were going down there to do the TV and then going back up to the north part of the state.
And sometimes you'd be going back down Sunday, because they'd run, if they had a real hot angle, their live show was Wednesday in Columbus. Then you go down and do the TV and then make the spot show back up. But Sunday afternoon was a big blow-off show, so you're back down in Columbus again. But I'm telling you,
the trips weren't long, but it was frequent.
You're passing yourself on the highway.
So then the next day, you said Marietta on Sundays, the Cobb Civic Center.
Yeah.
Which was right there in town. That was an office town. Was there a local promoter for Marietta in those days, or was it really just an office town?
I think the promoter was it was an office town. The guy that took charge was either Ole at the time, or Bobby Simmons, or one of the
maybe Charlie McGowan.
Yeah, Charlie McGowan, and then
one of the referees also, Charlie Smith.
And everybody used to look forward to Sunday because you knew you were going to be in Marietta, and it's like it's the slow down period.
Yeah.
Although it isn't, but it's only 12 miles.
Well, you'd be back home at 10:30, and then you leave for Augusta. And back in those days, Atlanta
Monday you're all
traffic
over again.
Was not anything like it is now. So Augusta was 140 miles, and it would take you 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
So you go Augusta on Monday, the Bell Auditorium.
Yep.
That was another town that ran the traditional Atlanta tape, but they syndicated it to the local station there.
Right.
Fred and Ralph didn't have anything to do with that. Was there a local promoter in Augusta in those days?
I'm sure there was, but I don't remember the name, gentlemen.
So then you, Tuesday and Wednesday, as we mentioned, back over to Macon and Columbus. Talk a little bit about Frank Morrell, the Angel, used to say, one of the things he used to say when he'd get in the locker room, he'd get down there and Fred would come in like he went to survey all of his troops. And as soon as Ward would walk out of the locker room, Frank would say, "Fat Freddie, we're ready." I guess Fred was a former wrestler in the 40s himself. He had that demeanor and that appearance.
Yeah, I think so. He was, the only thing I can remember about Fred, I was around Ralph a lot more, and Ralph was sort of the front man and protector of Fred.
Yeah.
But there was a standing joke that when Fred would shake your hand, the better the house was, the more his hand would tilt. So you knew that it was going to be a so-so house, a pretty good house, or it was really going to be a good house.
And I guess Ralph was one son-in-law, and then Fred's daughter Rose married Leon Ogle.
Yeah, I didn't know him very much.
He had wrestled years before that in Georgia, so they had a piece of the ABC booking office. And Rooster, Ralph, was not sometimes the most popular guy with all the guys. He tended to rub some people the wrong way. From what I remember being told, I was just happy to be there at the point I met all these people.
Me too. I never had a problem with Ralph. A lot of, and there again, you don't know what transpires between guys. And I try to, if I'm treated okay, and I witness him treating most people okay, then that's fine. If he's shitting on a lot of people, then he's shitting on me eventually too.
Yeah.
So, but.
Were you there when Austin Idol cashed the Battle Royal?
Oh, I was, yeah.
Please tell it firsthand.
Oh my God. We used to do Battle Royals. Too many Battle Royals. And they used to give you a legitimate check. That was the gimmick. If you won a $1,500 Battle Royal or a $5,000 Battle Royal or $10,000 Battle Royal, it was a real check. You could cash it. And I used to get upset with Bobby Heenan was my manager at the time, and I used to get upset because, they're not going to give everybody an opportunity.
Well,
they're trying to push guys that need a little bit of push.
They thought the loophole was if they made it out to Battle Royal winner. Okay, well, yeah it's okay,
So I used to kid Bobby. I said, "Bobby, don't enter me into any more Battle Royals. The damn entrance fee's $150, and I'm doing 10 of them, and then you can only win 1,000. It's bad economics here." But Austin won the Battle Royal. He wasn't the only one that cashed check. A different idea. And I believe he went to the bank, and did he get a fence put in or something, or his?
Yeah, well, that was the way he gave his notice of the territory, from what I heard. For one thing, was cashing that check. But he apparently, because everybody in town went to the matches, the way I heard it was, since it was made out to Battle Royal winner.
Oh yeah.
He found somebody in the bank that had been at the matches.
Oh yeah.
And he won the Battle Royal. Okay.
Well,
and they gave him the $5,000, whatever it was.
Thunderbolt Patterson one time won a Cadillac tournament. They brought the Cadillac down in, put it in the Omni, put it on that revolving thing. It was a nice shiny copper Cadillac. The winner of tonight's tournament's going to win the Cadillac. Thunderbolt Patterson won the Cadillac. He didn't make a couple of payments. They called the office. They said, "He doesn't make any payments on this Cadillac." Thunderbolt went to the office and says, "Hey, I won the Cadillac." The office had to end up paying for it to lose face. Yeah.
Columbus was the town also that Tim Woods got his finger bitten off.
Yeah, I wasn't there, but I know that happened in that town. And he continued to wrestle, right?
Yeah. Well, he was doing it. They didn't do the fan challenge anymore, because Tim was a shooter, amateur wrestler, and they would do the deal where, to make the business more legitimate, they said, "Mr. Wrestling has this open challenge. If you can go 5 minutes or 10 minutes with him or whatever, we'll give you X amount of dollars." And one night, because Columbus is, what's the Army base over Fort Benning?
Fort Bragg, I think.
That's North Carolina. Fort Benning.
Yeah.
It's
where
one
they
of
got
those
the
forts.
Rangers, yeah.
Yeah. You're one of those guys, and a bunch of his buddies were there, and I'm sure alcohol was involved, and the guy couldn't do anything with Woods as a wrestler. So when Tim tried to crossface him, he had his finger there, and the guy just bit his finger off the second knuckle. And needless to say, made Tim a little pissed. And I think I even heard that he whipped the mask off so that he would, because it was going south and beat the shit out of the guy, but he still didn't have no finger. So
I could never understand Tim's dealings with the mask, because sometimes in one town he would wear the mask and he would be wrestling number 1. And then the next night it would be Tim Woods.
Yeah.
And then the next night he'd be back as wrestling number 1 under a mask. So I don't know if Tim really knew who he was.
Well, and they did the deal one time when he, much earlier, I guess late 60s, maybe early 70s, where he got the NWA World Championship match, but before the match, you know, since if he won, they needed to know who the champion was, the NWA, so they made him take the mask off, and that's when he revealed himself. So then I think they were going to take it off of him and maybe keep it off, but the people were so enamored of Mr. Wrestling in the white mask, like American version of El Santo. They said, okay, we know who he is, but we don't care. We like, so he Mr. Wrestling Tim Woods.
Yeah, that baffled me a little bit, because that was happening when I was first going down there. So
it was a little strange.
Yeah.
When you first went into Georgia, we talked. Well, and let's finish up the week. Thursday, as you said, was Rome, which is hometown of Marty Lundy, a.k.a. Arn Anderson, Pee Wee Anderson, the referee, Tony Zane, a lot of guys came from Rome. And then Friday night you were back in Atlanta. Who was booking at that point that you started? Was it Ole by then?
When I first went down to stay, yes, Ole was the booker. Actually, Ole had asked me, he was coming back and forth into the Carolinas and been dabbling with promoting and booking there, as well as booking in Georgia.
Yeah.
And he asked me to come down, and he said, it's only going to be a short time, you know. And of course, I didn't know, but when I got down there, I really liked it.
Explain to people now who, everybody reads the internet, knows, okay, well, there's a writer for the promos, and there's an agent to lay out the matches, and there's a creative team to write the direction and everything. Explain the relationship between the booker and the talent at that point, and how everybody worked together to manipulate the outcome. But you worked with your opponent, and the booker got your suggestions. What have you done in other territories? Who do you like to work with? What worked for you, and how it was put together?
Well, I recently had a conversation with a friend of mine that we were talking about what you had mentioned, writers and this and that. And it took me back to when I first went into Japan as a mass superstar. Vince McMahon Sr. was there, and of course Andre and I were good friends, and back and forth, and opponents and tag partners and opponents and all these tours. And we used to go on a tour, a tag tournament, Madison Square Garden, and then a Madison Square Garden singles. Well, every one of these events, Senior would come. And he took a liking to me, and he says, boy, I want you to come into New York. I said, well, I'd love to. I said, Andre talks highly about it, and I've heard about it. And he said, but I want you to come in as a cowboy. I said, a cowboy? I said, why would you want me to come in as a cowboy? He says, I got an idea. I said, sir, what did you like about seeing me wrestle? He says, well, the way you carry yourself and, you know, your movement and this and that. I said, I wouldn't have any of that as a cowboy because I'm not a cowboy.
Yeah.
I am, and I've become a masked man. I know my character. But if I went in as a cowboy and I stepped out in the gardens, first thing I'd think, I'd look around, how many cowboys they got out here? I can't ride a horse. I can't put a saddle on. Somebody's going to see right through it. I'm going to be a phony.
Yeah.
I am the mass superstar. I'm not a cowboy. If you want me to come in, and that's when they had that silly rule, you could wrestle all through the New York area, but you couldn't wrestle in the garden with a mask on. So you had to cut the face out. So what?
Yeah.
So I says, I appreciate it, and I'm honored, and I'm humbled, but I'm not coming in as a cowboy.
I want to be a cowboy.
But getting back to what you were saying, you have to know you can't be Jimmy Hart because you'd feel self-conscious. You could probably do Jimmy Hart, and Jimmy might be able to do some of yours, or you can't be another manager because you're established. You feel comfortable with you. everybody has to be their person. You have to live that person, you have to walk that person, you have to think like that person, therefore you are that person. And it just flows. But a writer who watches 25 different guys can't be 25 different people.
Yeah.
He's going to screw up. The big thing, the biggest drawback I saw is when they had Bobby Heenan. Bobby would fly off you'd give him a subject, tell him where the town is, who the opponent is, boom, boom, boom. He'd take it and go and he'd make a hit.
Yeah.
Score a bullseye every time. Well, then somebody told him, well, no, you got to say this, you got to say that. So he's too worried, and what's the product now? They're so worried about what they have to say and worried about leaving a couple things out that they do.
Yeah. Or they don't have any conviction because you can see them reciting the words but looking inside themselves rather than boring a hole in the camera and looking to the opponent, etc. And when you sit down with like you in wrestling too, which you get to in a minute, there was a huge program. You would sit down with Ole, and Ole would say, "Hey, what'd you guys do in that match last week? I saw that pop the people, and it had some way we need to slip you over, Bill, some way screw him a little bit so we can bring it back. Next week's stipulation is such and such."
Well, first of all, you have to have confidence that you're not going to get screwed. And I had confidence in Ole. Ole had faith in me. I had confidence and faith in wrestling too. I think if anybody talks to him, he trusted me as well. I wasn't there to bury him. It's like when Barry and I went into matches, we weren't there to bury our opponents. We were there to make sure that we had the best match on the card.
Yeah.
Hopefully we do. And you have to have that confidence in your ability. I also knew that if for some reason I think I'm getting shafted, I'll give them a 2-week notice, and there's 100 places I can go.
Yeah.
I had a standing contract with, all I had to do was pick up the phone literally, and I could be in Japan tomorrow. So I felt confident in my ability, but I didn't use that as a weapon. I'd say, well, if you don't do this, I'm gonna leave. That was in my back pocket. You gotta have something.
If it came to it, you say, okay, I'll do that. And well, and a lot of times, and Bill Watts, one of the first things I learned, he had a meeting with the talent at TV one night, and he said, if you are a babyface or a heel, and you come to the matches without a way to win and still keep your opponent over, or without a way to lose and still not kill yourself, then you're like a carpenter that came without his toolbox.
Yeah.
Why'd you show up?
Yeah.
You had the opportunity when the booker would say, hey, once again, we're going to do this, a little of that tonight, and we need to slip so-and-so over. What do you got?
Yeah.
And you'd pitch things, and he'd tweak it a little bit. Okay, let's do that.
Yeah.
And that was the extent of there was no agent sitting down telling you how to have the match because you didn't know what the people were buying.
Well, the agent,
until you got out there.
Yeah, the agent, exactly. You get guys in the back room, and they're going over 14 or 15 or sometimes 20 spots when you only need 2 or 3. Especially when you're back in Atlanta.
The rest of it's going to happen in the ring. You don't need to.
And it might not even come up. But they do it anyway because they were told to do it. And they were told if they don't do it, I've got to write a report.
Yeah, the report.
See? And the thing is, unfortunately now, you and I are in a different era.
Generation.
They've surrounded themselves with people who are afraid.
Yeah.
No one would come in. I would never come in as a booker and say, Jimmy, this is what I want you to say. I might say, okay, or how to say it. I'd say, Jimmy, the town is Chattanooga. Your team's opponents are so-and-so. And let's go with it.
And I'd say,
you're coming back in 2 weeks.
Well, I'd say, what's the rules of the match, or what are we coming back with? And otherwise, that's all you need to know.
Yeah, but for me to tell you, and then you're going out there, and I'm going to be in Chattanooga next week, and and you're not putting your heart in it because you're trying to remember what they told you, but you're not afraid because you said, if the worst thing can happen to you, you should get fired. That's all.
Well, now the reason why everybody's scared is because they don't have anything in their back pocket because the pants have been stripped off the business.
Yeah.
But one of the things you did when you first came to Georgia was the Cobra Hole Challenge. $1,000 to anybody that could
Well,
break
one of the
Cobra
first
hole,
things when I came to Georgia, I looked around and there was 15 masked guys there.
Yeah.
So, and Ole had approached me that. He says, we got too many damn masked guys in here. He says, your objective is going to come down, and you're going to eliminate one by one all the masked men in the territory and expose them and run them out of the territory, and it's going to come down to you in wrestling number 2. Because he's a big baby face, you guys are going to make money. I said, okay.
There you go. That's what you work toward.
Yeah.
That's what you need to know.
And he would do his promos. I see what you're doing, and eventually it's going to come down to you and I, and my promos would be, one's gone, this guy's gone, your friend's gone, this guy's gone, and eventually you're going to be gone. And I'm going to be standing here, and there's nothing you can do about it.
And let me just read your mind, and every time that you started wrestling after those promos played, regardless of who you were in the ring with, the people would be chanting 2.
Oh, yes.
2, 2, 2.
2 was
because you had you made the people call for the match, a la the way that Bill Watts did with and Bill Dundee did with Midnight Rock and Roll.
Yeah.
You made the people call for the match before you gave them the match, and that way they felt it was their idea and they really wanted to see it there.
Yeah, and sometimes I would be standing off stage just behind the curtains peeping out when he was in the ring. And of course he'd be alerted by somebody, and then the camera would pan over. And then eventually he started doing the same thing. So it was projected way down the road. There was still a lot of masked men in there. And we even brought in a couple fake wrestling too.
Yeah, just to
add salt to the wound. And eventually it got to the point where, we had the matches, and a lot of people made statements that they didn't like wrestling with 2, but I enjoyed it. I think he trusted me, I trusted him. I knew he was a professional. He was just there to make money and to do the best he could do, and I was the same thing.
He'd been in the business 30 years, and he was a pro, and he knew what to do. And I think the thing that held him back as Johnny Rubberman Walker was just facially, 2 always looked old when he was young.
Yeah.
And he was kind of nondescript, but athletic, and he knew how to work. And when he put that mask on, then that gave him an aura of mystery, and it accentuated his strengths and eliminated his weaknesses.
And he did a very serious, hardcore babyface interview. I got some advice from not only Boris Malenko, but early in my career, Wahoo McDaniel, who was a big babyface at the time, said, be careful what you say, because the people are listening. If you're a babyface, you can't make outlandish statements and not back them up. You'll lose face.
Yeah.
A heel can go a little bit overboard, but I often did in my interviews, I was deliberate, and I would try to put myself in a fan's position. And there again, I talked about this recently. It's silly for me to go out there and say, I'm going to go tonight in New Jersey, and Jim Cornette, I'm going to break every bone in your leg. Well, if I don't do it, I lose face. And it's probably not logical I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
But Jim, you and I are going to get in that ring. And at the end of the night, I guarantee you're going to be hurt. I'm still going to get the point across.
But it's open-ended.
Yeah.
It could be hurt in some kind of way.
And what hurt is to you might not be to him or her. Oh my goodness, he's going to break my fingers. He's going to break my wrist. He's going to break my knee. He's going to twist my neck.
And
so it's open.
And two had that fire under that mask, and he'd look at the camera, and when we did a program with him in Louisiana, there was a belt whipping involved where the loser, we'd whipped him with the belts and then came back where the loser got 5 lashes each or whatever, and he looked at the camera and he said, and Cornette, I'm going to get you too, and by the time I finish with you, you won't know whether to walk, talk, or crawl. I mean, and people got with it, so every time we'd be wrestling another team or on television with job guys, the people would be chanting, two.
Oh, yeah.
Two. And
I can still
Bobby
see,
Eaton at
I can
first
still see his head twitch.
and his head would twitch. Bobby Eaton at first didn't know. He thought they were boo. He said, that's the way they boo down here. Two had the $1 million knee lift.
Oh, my goodness.
And Bobby Eaton took such good bumps for it, right? That even Two, the old pro that he was, he got himself caught up in the moment. He loved the bumps that Bobby would take. Because one time, he'd hit Bobby with a knee lift, and Bobby'd fly over the top rope without touching anything. And next time he'd take some kind of corkscrew bump and land on his face in the ring. And next time he'd do something else.
Yeah.
So Two all of a sudden realized after the first week or two of the program, he's hitting Bobby Eaton with his finish 3 or 4 times in the match, and we're still winning.
Yeah.
And then you couldn't get him to hit anybody with a knee lift after that. But going back to the Cobra hold.
I got hit with a bunch of stiff.
Yeah, and it was good. It was there, right?
They were there, and you had to be alert, boy.
But that's where I was going with the Cobra hold. Just the idea that you got a hold. He got the knee lift over because when he hit it, somebody went down. The $1 million knee lift. You got the Cobra hold over because you paid people if they could even escape it.
$10,000 bounty.
And that's the way you got to hold over. It had to work consistently. First against an underneath guy, then against a middle card guy. Finally, when you got to the top guys, they would have hope, and you might have to just pull that little heel tactic.
Yeah.
And,
or you would roll them over into the. They never broke it. The referee would break it periodically.
Yeah.
And if Andre the Giant, said, I'm not breaking the hold. So if Andre can't get out of it, who's going to get out of it?
Because there's only so many holes and moves you can do that don't just cripple somebody. So if you prostitute all of them, so for example, if you super kick somebody 75 times and don't win the match and don't beat anybody with it, then
or drop kick somebody, fly and drop kick somebody 25 times.
Or whatever the case may be. We've gone over the schedule. What was the money like at that point, late 70s in Georgia?
It was good.
Well, I bring it up because
you don't work for the IRS, do you?
I do not, and I have never, and I disavow any knowledge of same. And the statute of limitations, by the way, has run out. But I've mentioned many times, I'm just flabbergasted by this. We've talked about it on other episodes of this program. A guy like Ole, I use him as an example, but I was making, between working main event Carolinas and booking and having a piece of the office in Atlanta, I was making $250,000 a year.
Yeah.
Jerry Lawler in Memphis, people wonder, why did Jerry Lawler never go anywhere else? Why would he was making a couple of $100,000 a year and home every night in Tennessee, and then became part owner of the promotion. The top guys, Vince McMahon Sr. or Jr. did not create big money in wrestling, and especially when you adjust, as I think somebody in our peanut gallery has the app, when you adjust it to today's money, those $5,000 and $6,000 payoffs for an NWA World Title match in St. Louis in 1982 would be $18,000 for one night's work.
Oh yeah.
In 2016.
I made good money when I was in New York as Demolition, and I made good money when I was in Japan as Superstar. But the money that I made in Japan was based on the money that I had made in the Carolinas and I had made in Georgia, because it correlated. You know, a lot of the boys go to Japan and they say, oh, the Japanese are dumb. They don't know what you're making, so they all ask for this astronomical. They contact Crocketts, they contact Barnett, they contact Ole. What's so-and-so making? What's so-and-so making? Well, you go over and you tell them, oh, I'm making $5,000 a week. No, you're not. You're making $500. So they give you maybe $750 or $1,000, and you say, okay, I'll give you a deal. But in my case, I literally, my first deal, of course, I went with Guido. After that, I went over because I gave my word to Inoki. I lost money. I was losing $2,000 and $3,000 a week going to Japan.
From Georgia.
From Georgia. But I gave Inoki my word, and I told him, I said, you don't believe this. And I took my paychecks for 6 or 8 weeks. And I said, here's what I'm making here, and here's what I'm making home. But I told you I was coming, and I gave you my word. But I don't think I'm going to be able to come anymore. So, okay, appreciate that, thank you. Then all of a sudden, I get another call, and the money in Japan was over the money in Georgia. But it wouldn't have been if I wasn't honest with
for
it.
example, because I know some of the payoffs we were making as a tag team manager combination in Charlotte a few years after this, but single main event in the Omni, one of those big houses, was a couple of grand in those days, right?
Yeah, probably $3,000, $3,500.
And you know, I remember at one point in
you're like you were saying, I don't know if the people understand it. That's like a $8,000 or $10,000 payoff now.
Yeah, adjusted for all of the things they ingested.
You know, you were getting gas at 52 cents a gallon. And
that was a beautiful part also in Atlanta. No hotels.
No hotels.
You put 3 or 4 guys in a car that have fun riding with each other, drinking beer, to go to the town that's 140 miles away, and you stop at McDonald's. And back then, the biggest meal on the card was $2
Everything was
or whatever.
$1. Everything was $1.
Yeah, and so you spent nothing, and you're getting these $2,000-3,000 a week checks on an average week.
Yeah.
As a main event guy. I remember underneath guys in Louisiana at one point, the opening match guys, when business was hot, we're doing $800, $1,000
Yes,
a week.
and where do you make that at that time? Even now,
Yeah.
there's a lot of people that would be love to make $500, $600, $700, $800 every week.
It just once again the amount of people, the tickets were affordable.
Yeah,
What do you think top ticket was then in the Omni? $8, $10?
maybe 10.
Maybe 10.
But now, if you go, and I noticed that they're coming back to Atlanta, the other big group that's in there, it's $275
Oh,
a
geez.
seat. Well,
Got to take out a credit app.
First of all, do you go to Disney World for half that
Yeah.
and enjoy yourself all day, or do you not go at $275 and watch 4 or 5 matches that might be okay? So, how do you equate that from $10 to $275? This is not WrestleMania. This is a night at the Omni now.
Well, speaking of a night at the Omni, New Year's Day 1979, here's another card for you. NWA World Heavyweight Championship, Harley Race versus Andre the Giant. Georgia Tag Team Championship, Jack and Jerry Briscoe against Dorian Terry Funk. Dusty Rhodes and Wildfire Tommy Rich against Ernie Ladd and Stan Hansen. And, not to ignore, among these 6 other matches, featured prominently the Georgia Heavyweight Champion, the Masked Superstar, against Mr. Wrestling 2. That program had finally had started. It would carry on and off for the better part of the next 3 years because people couldn't get enough of you and 2. Something real quick we got to bring up before we go any further.
Talking about the Georgia Championship tag team, neither team was from Georgia.
Yeah, neither team was working a territory, but they wanted the Briscoes and the
Yeah.
Funks, and and Ole would play fast and loose with the facts sometimes. But
Right.
talk about Tommy Rich, because Tommy Rich has taken such just a browbeating from a lot of the boys over the years that started rumors because he was cute and he was blonde, and why in the world, they said, would he be chosen to have a run with the NWA World Championship even for a week? And my answer was because he was at the time the hottest babyface in the business, and
I
Jim Barnett had the power to do it for him.
I agree with you, because Tommy had fire.
Yeah.
Tommy Rich had a good babyface interview. He's a good-looking guy. He could have benefited from going to the gym, but he didn't need to because everybody loved him anyway.
Yeah.
You couldn't have a bad match with Tommy. You just couldn't have a bad match.
He sold. He knew how to sell, and you felt for him. There was the old Tennessee.
Yeah.
The one thing the baby faces from Tennessee could do is sell.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed working with him. It was night and day working with him in Wrestling 2, because 2 different characters. They're both over baby faces, but
you
why
will
not-
put to rest for the record that there was never any favors done as was, because that.
I think like you said at the outset, a little bit of jealousy goes a long way.
The guys
and
that
there were-
never got it had to figure out a reason for the guys that did get it.
Exactly.
Otherwise, they're better than
Exactly.
me.
I mean, yeah, but Tommy was better than a lot, and was a good friend, is a good friend. I'm going to see him in a couple legend signings and stuff, and Tommy had it.
Yeah.
Some guys have it. They're not physically imposing, but man, he had the people to the point where they felt that they had to help him.
Yeah.
And he lived off of that support. The more that they cheered for him, the more he could come back.
And once again, he could talk, and he had that way to talk to those people.
Yeah.
He may not have played in New Jersey, but by God, down here in the state of Georgia.
Well, you know what? It played in the Midwest. It played every place that TBS
You know what?
went.
Cute eyes and blonde hair plays a lot of
That's right.
places, I guess. Here's somebody that must have been a challenge. As Georgia champion, you wrestled a number of people. Thunderbolt Patterson. How'd you get a match out of the T-Bolt?
I didn't get a match out of it. I know Thunderbolt's an ordained minister. Thunderbolt tried to get me fired a couple times.
For what?
Because he figured I was trying to beat him up, and I was trying to make a match out of it. I tell a story one time, the people know Greg Valentine. Well, my finish, setting up the finish to the Cobra, was a flying clothesline. So I tell this to get to Thunderbolt. I throw Valentine in, and when you see Greg, ask him. I hit Valentine with a clothesline. I left my feet. and I, boom, hit the mat, and I'm looking around.
Yeah, that's right. It wasn't a lariat style. It was when you caught him, you kicked your feet out, he kicked his feet out, and
Boom.
down, boom.
And I come off the rope 150 miles an hour and laid it into him. I hit the mat, and I look, and Valentine's just rocking, rocking in the middle of the ring. Staggers, and he goes against the damn rope. Next night, I work against him again. I guess, well, okay, throw him in, and I went through him.
Yeah.
And I heard a, ooh, and he went down. After the match, says, the hell did you hit me so hard for? I said, well, last night I thought I missed you, so I want to make sure. So I did the same thing to Thunderbolt Patterson. He wouldn't sell. This business is give and take. It's not take.
Yeah.
I want to have a good match. I want you to have a good match, but we have to have a good match together. Thunderbolt was in it for him. So we were working in Marietta, Georgia, never forget. I get home about 11:30, get a phone call. My boy, you have to come in and talk to me tomorrow. Talk to you, see you in the morning. He called Barnett as soon as he got off the,
T-Bone's upset.
yeah.
Do you
But
think?
I didn't get fired.
Well,
We just had to just switch it. You know who was really pissed off? Ole, because Ole, they took me out of the program with Thunderbolt, and Ole had to work around.
and now Ole's the thanks.
Because
a lot
nobody
for the-
wanted to work
yeah.
with Thunderbolt.
And and that was a shame because there was a guy that at one point drew tremendous money, and he had the ability to talk. He was a natural with the black audience in the South, but he appealed to everybody wherever he went, white, black, whatever. He talked, and he had that rap and that aura about him, but
Jim,
he couldn't or wouldn't.
Here's what happens. You know it. How many guys will you see in an event that actually believed they did what they did?
Yeah,
You didn't help them, and I didn't help them. They won.
yeah.
No, we helped them win.
Yeah, but that's their and that's. Do you think that's why he adopted the every time that he couldn't get a job or couldn't get a push, because you couldn't put a belt on him because you couldn't get it off of him, from what I understand.
Couldn't have a Cadillac tournament.
You couldn't have Cadillac tournament. He'd keep the car,
Yeah.
and then and Ole booked him many more times than most people would, because Ole knew that he was a money card, and he did like him, but. That's when he started the discrimination lawsuits. If he couldn't get booked, well, I'll sue.
Yeah.
And then they'd give him a pity booking, and that didn't do anybody any good.
Yeah.
Was he his own worst enemy? Because he at one point was such a big star and just.
Well, see, I can't comment on it honestly because I don't like the guy.
Okay.
And there's not too many people, you know me.
Yeah.
I like almost everybody.
Well, let's talk about another unpopular asshole, Jim Wilson.
I didn't know Jim very much, but I don't know if he was as bad as Thunderbolt. But boy, he got money for not doing much.
Well, the thing is, he believed, and once I saw him very early when I saw him on television. I've read his book. For those of you who don't know, Jim Wilson was former college football star in Georgia who was broken in the wrestling business, and later on
He played for the Falcons, right?
yeah, not only college but pro, yes.
Yeah.
And later on sued, and actually he and Thunderbolt worked together quite a bit. Tried to sue Barnett because he said the reason why he was not made the NWA World Heavyweight Champion is because he wouldn't go to bed with Barnett. And this is a guy who never worked anywhere but the territory of Georgia, where he was established as a legitimate sports star, because he wasn't very good and he wasn't getting any better. And
Exactly.
he didn't have it. And now whether the promoters told him one day he'd be the world heavyweight champion, that's entirely possible. Because, hey, boy, you'll be farting through silk. The promoters tell you a lot of things.
Yeah.
But for him to actually have believed it enough to write a book, go on television, make these claims, file lawsuits, it was only because I wouldn't sleep with Barnett. If Jim Barnett was going to sleep, and there's no evidence that he ever did with any wrestlers, would he have picked Jim Wilson first?
I don't think so. And I think that was his close association with T-Bolt. That was the way to...
T-Bolt in the ear.
Yeah, and I remember Jim, and I never remember him being heavyweight champion quality.
No.
But, you know, maybe we all look in different mirrors. You know, we all have flaws, and we don't see the gray hair and the thinning hair, and you know,
The no hair.
yeah, it's just.
You had a program. Let's go back to the talent. You had a program there for a while with Wahoo McDaniel. Talk about the Chief.
Oh, my
One of the
goodness.
most unique characters and toughest guys in the history of the business.
You talk about an athlete, an all-around athlete, golfer, fisherman, football player, softball player, honest, good guy, give you the shirt off his back, literally. My wife's Native American, Lakota Sioux, and Wahoo sort of adopted her, although he was Choctaw. But what a good guy.
He could play golf with Lee Trevino competitively, played pro football for several teams, was a pro wrestler at a high level,
Yeah.
was a high school four-sport star. Flair says he's the toughest man that ever walked. Was there anything Wahoo couldn't do? And until his mobility was compromised with age in the ring, he was, you know, he'd take that upside-down bump in the turnbuckle better than, you know, anybody but Ray Stevens.
And they had the most wicked chop of all.
It would hit the marks. Remember when they switched him heel and the marks would come at him, he'd hit the marks with the chops and knock him out.
Yeah. I remember a funny story. Wahoo and I were in the middle of a program. And not that I bruise easy, but when you get hit by a jackhammer coming at you 20 times in 1 week, you end up bruising. So one night, we was in Scope in Norfolk, and I says, Wahoo, can I talk to you? Yeah, boy, what's up? I said, Wahoo, my wife, your friend, doesn't want to see tonight's match on my chest tomorrow morning. What are you talking about? He says, you're killing me with those chops. I'm bruised and I'm bleeding. Him and Valentine and Flair, they used to have these chopping battles where they were literally busting each other's skin open. I said, that's for you three. I don't want to see that. Boy, okay. That was it.
Throw Ronnie Garvin in there too with the overhand.
Yeah,
right?
the overhand. Oh my God.
And as a matter of fact, the maddest that the Midnight Express ever got at me, Bobby and Dennis Condrey, was when I cut a promo. It was Wahoo McDaniel and Ronnie Garvin teaming up, and I called them Fred Flintstone and Barney Rubble. And they took it out on Bobby and Dennis. And Dennis come after the match, he said, don't ever say that about them ever again.
My God, he was Wahoo. There's another one. He had pizzazz, he had fire. He wasn't afraid to sell. He knew what this business was about.
Yeah.
It was getting the people to get behind you to fight off the evil empire. That's it. It's not rocket science.
Who was it said white hat, black hat? White hat wins in the end.
Yeah.
There you go. There's wrestling.
And if the black hat has the belt, the babyface has the belt, people are cheering, but you didn't win it legitimately, I'm not taking it. Drop it off on the guy's chest.
Boom.
He's out in the middle of the ring. I'm going to get it. I'm going to win it legitimately, the right way.
But that's not taking into account work rate and quality of backstory on the storyline of the booking of
Well,
the
that
program.
wasn't written by the writers.
Yeah. So you spent the first year in Georgia, it was the constant matches with wrestling too, but also, as we mentioned, anybody from T-Bolt to Wahoo to Tony Atlas, another guy.
Yeah.
Who was tremendously over and looked like $1 million with the audience, and a heck of an athlete.
And
for
I
that
enjoyed
size.
working with Tony because it was, he would listen to you. He knew that he needed to learn, and we all do. I mean, you could still get in the ring today and learn something new.
Yeah.
Just keep your eyes and ears open and try something. Don't try something goofy. A lot of times now guys try something that they think they can do. Well, do you have your practice? No, but I think I can do. Well, have you tried it? No, but I saw it. Don't do it until you can perfect it.
I woke up this morning, I dreamed I could do it.
And
so,
actually, guys do that, you know.
And want to do it with you. That's the problem. If you do your own shit, that's fine. But well, here's another blast from the past in Atlanta, November 22nd, 1979, because every Thanksgiving was the annual Thanksgiving Tag Team Tournament. And that night, you and Austin Idol, heck of a team, beat the Briscoes in the finals, and you won the Georgia Tag Team title. But you
Finally, a team from Georgia.
Well, there you go. But you lost them back a week later to the Briscoes, and then the week after that, you beat Tommy Rich and regained the Georgia Heavyweight Championship and went back to Wrestling 2 in the Omni main events. Was Ole just he liked to switch belts a lot?
No.
What was going on there?
The Briscoes had part of the territory.
Okay, well that's true. I forgot. At that time it was Barnett, Paul Jones, Fred Ward, and Ralph, and the Briscoes had piece, and Eddie. Actually, that piece was kind of the floating Florida piece, because at one time Buddy Fuller owned part of Georgia, and Lester Welch, his uncle, owned part of Florida, and they decided they wanted to move, so they just switched.
Yeah,
they just traded.
Yeah,
you could do that then.
Yeah, but they Ole always left the door open to go back to guys that he had.
The program he wanted to do, and his local guys. Yeah.
Why did these guys come in on Thanksgiving, on Christmas, on New Year's? Because the Omni was a hell of a building.
Pick up their check.
It was going to draw, and not only are they getting a portion of their ownership, they're also getting a better payday too.
Yeah.
You can't blame them for doing that. I mean, if you own a territory, you say, I think I'm going to go take a trip to Florida today. Put me on the cart. What are you going to say? No.
Those big events in the Omni on the holidays and the big blow-offs were 13,000 people, 15,000 people.
Yeah.
And that
the same amount of people.
That's a weekly town. That's the city auditorium was what, 5,000-6,000 seats?
Probably
like
5,000 or 6,000. So you'd do 3 weeks city auditorium, 4th week
Omni.
3 weeks, 4. 3 weeks, 4.
And when 1980 started, it was trouble again. you lost the Georgia title in a cage match to Wrestling 2, but there we were just talking about the auditorium. At the city of Atlanta closed finally the city auditorium. The Omni was the only game in town. This was a big bone of contention with the promotion and trouble later, because you could run a 5,000 or 6,000 seat building 3 weeks in a row and then run the 4th at the Omni. But now all of a sudden, do you run a 17,000 seat building, even a city as hot as Atlanta, every week, or do you cut back the number of shows, which they ended up went to every 2 weeks? Point is, that was a steady income source that was mitigated.
I think that was the time that Georgia State University bought that land from the city, and now it's all encompassed. Big university there, 40 or 50,000 students, right on that property.
Yeah.
But you're right. It went from you use those 3 weeks to build up
to build the big one.
To the big one, and then boom, and then it's not done yet. You're coming back, or somebody else is starting their program. The nice thing about Georgia, you had King Kong Mosca there. You had Stan Hansen, myself, 5 or 6 top guys on both sides of the coin.
Yeah.
And you might be in Augusta on Monday at the main event for the 3rd time, but the 4th time you're in the first match again. But you knew you were going to work your way up.
Yeah.
As long as and the money wasn't that different.
It wasn't an insult in those days for a top guy to be bumped down the card after he finished a program. When you're in between programs, you've shot an angle on TV, you're waiting for it to play around, so the booker would put you in an underneath match to get a win. Especially if you'd come out, if you were a heel and you came out on the wrong end of the program you just finished, you'd be underneath a couple weeks to get wins while you were doing whatever you're going to do on TV.
And the guy that you had just worked with was the same situation, but there's always still tension between you, but you're also starting a new adversary with this guy or this guy, this guy. So you knew that if you were in the main event, say you make $500 that night. Well, the first guy's making 2 or 3. So at the end of the week, the difference is only going to be minimal. And it's going to rotate. Just hang in for a little bit. Everybody was working to bring in seats, to bring in people in the seats.
Yeah.
They would come for the main event. They would come for the 2nd match. They'd come for the 3rd match. A lot of people were coming for the opening match because they had a little contention between them. So everybody contributed.
We've talked about Atlanta. At this point, how were the other towns doing? Because Columbus, I remember the Municipal Auditorium was a 5,000 seat building. Macon, at the time, the Macon Coliseum, I think, was a little bit too big. I remember
Macon was probably 8,000 or 9,000. Now,
wouldn't fill up a lot.
If we would have had the Macon Coliseum or the Columbus building when they shut down the auditorium,
Atlanta,
it would still be going.
Cobb Civic Center held about 2,000 people. Rome wasn't a big building, but it wasn't a long trip. Augusta was that was the Bell Auditorium back in those days. That was a nice place. And then they went to the Civic Center later on.
And they had all the spot shows, Porterdale and Carrollton and all these places would seat
Psychic
would
together.
seat 1,500, 18. Sometimes the fire marshal would come say no more.
And every once in a while
Depending on
you go down to Valdosta, but you would go to these high school gyms in wherever, Wartburg, Georgia, and you'd have 1,200 or 1,500 people jumping up and down and screaming.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, in one state of Georgia, counting, especially on a week that the Omni ran a big show, you would easily have 30,000 people see your live matches just that week.
We were sometimes, and sometimes we'd have 3 shows a night. 3 shows a night in Georgia.
In the summertime, they'd split it up and they'd have smaller shows, but more of them. You were out of the territory for several months in 1980. Was that a Japanese trip, or did you go
I was going back
else?
and forth to Japan all the time. Like I said, I had an arrangement with Inoki, so they would send me the year's contract, and then they would send me the calendar for the year in January. So they'd say, well, pick 12 weeks, you want to come. So I got smart after a while. I'd go 1 week, instead of going 8, first couple of tours, they wanted me to go to 8. I said, I can't, I love Japan, but 8 weeks is a long time.
Yeah.
So then they went to 4, and then they'd say, okay, 2 and 3. And sometimes 1, sometimes 1 day. That's a long trip for 1 day.
Yeah. But were you noticing, I guess it was hard for you to, unless you were working, you obviously wearing the mask, you had an element of privacy that a lot of the guys didn't have, but when you would go to other places in this country and wrestle on your times out of the territory, were you noticing the increasing effect of TBS that was starting to, what was it, 77, they started going up on satellite, and by
we
a
were
couple
all
years
over the
later,
place.
you know, everybody was watching.
We were in Michigan, we were in Ohio. It got to the point where the roles reversed. We were only in Georgia to do the TVs on Saturday. We'd fly back Saturday morning early, do the TVs, and then fly back up, and was up in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana for a whole week.
That started in the late 70s. I remember they did Columbus first, because Columbus in this country was one of the first cities that was predominantly wired for a kind of a state-of-the-art at the time cable system. And they got TBS 17 was one of the stations they got, and the cable coverage was so good, even though it was spotty everywhere else at that point, that they started running the Ohio Center, and the Sheik had pretty much, you know, stick a fork in him, he's done, killed the territory with the hardcore stuff 5 years beforehand, so it was a virgin territory again, and the people were popping on headlocks. And I remember going up Cincinnati when Crockett opened up Cincinnati, and
Cincinnati
me
Gardens,
me and my friends, you know, we got there at like 7:30 for the 8 o'clock matches. I'd been to Cincinnati Gardens before. I hadn't drawn a house in 10 years. I said, well, we'll get third row. There was 8,000 people there. We got up in the bleachers as close as we could get. That territory, Ohio, Michigan, and parts of West Virginia that had been burnt and scorched earth and dead for a while, dark, as they say, all of a sudden became the new hotbed as you lost a city auditorium, and Georgia started, because they had seen every big name in the world, obviously, as we've just read, for so long that it was starting to be, they were jaded. It was a little harder to impress them, but all of a sudden, now you got a new territory.
Yeah. It was fantastic. Parkersburg. Who would think you go to Parkersburg in Marietta, Ohio, and 5,000 people are there. Canton. You know, I was in Canton when I first started as one of the Mongols was dying.
Yeah.
And then go in there and go, oh my God, your memories of Canton or Cincinnati, like you say. And then boom, there's thousands of people.
Cleveland, that old downtown building. My God, you take your life in your hand. They threw Vaseline jars, people's shoes, rocks.
Euclid Avenue.
Yes. Oh my God, it was dark, and that's where Ox Baker and Johnny Powers and Ernie Ladd had the riot. That building that's all over YouTube.
Talking about that, first time I was in that building, I was in there was a Mongol, and we were Ox Baker and everybody was in there, and we were sitting back in the dressing room, we're reading this wrestling magazine, and on the cover it says Bearcat Brown died, and they had a big article about recent, and then everybody said, oh my God, put the book down, they're getting ready, and Bearcat walks through the door. I thought you were dead. Yeah.
As a matter of fact, one time we were working for Crockett. When he first started running Texas, because the World Class was, kind of on the outs. We were at Reunion Arena. We walked in, and that's when rumor had gone out that Buddy Roberts was dead.
Yes.
And there was Buddy sitting there on the table, and Dennis Condrey looked at him and said, "Buddy, we heard you were dead." He waited for a beat, and he said, "I see they were right." But you weren't on the card for one of the most famous nights at the Omni, July 20th, 1980. I was there. First time I ever got to go to the Omni. Harley Race and Tommy Rich for the world title was the main event with Lou Thez referee, but that took a back seat to the cage match. Dusty Rhodes and Ole Anderson against the Assassins with two referees, Gene Anderson and Ivan Koloff. And it's on YouTube,
That's
folks.
where George Scott got the idea of the two referees and the stipulations.
And that is where that basically Ole had switched babyface a year beforehand, and he had teamed with Rich, and he'd teamed with Atlas, and he'd teamed with whoever, but he couldn't get Dusty to team with him. And finally, they'd got the team. They had one match, two matches, and then Ole said in that masterful promo, "I got it." I said, "How about a cage, Dusty? We can keep those Assassins in." I've never seen anything like this. As they got Dusty down, and he sold, and he juiced, and the Assassins are beating him up, and as soon as he tags Ole, and Ole jumps in, he looks at Gene, and he looks at the Assassins and Koloff, and he turns around, and he starts kicking the shit out of Ole too, or out of Dusty too. The people started climbing the cage. It was chaos. I would have been ringside shooting the thing had I not forgot to bring high-speed film because I couldn't shoot with the flash with the cage, blah, blah, blah. Long story. I just said, I'm going to go sit down for this one. I would have never gotten out of there alive. It was 30 minutes to get those guys out of the ring. The fans are climbing the cage. They're trying to knock them off.
Yeah.
Dusty's laying there bleeding. That was one of the hottest things I've ever seen in my life. And Dusty recreated it for Starrcade several years later with the Horsemen. But they came back 2 weeks later, and Andre was Dusty's partner against Ole and Gene. And Dusty loses and has to leave town, and he comes back 2 weeks later as Uvalde Slim, and he and Bill Watts beat Ole and Gene left. And on the same card that night, two beat you in a loser leave town match in the cage. Where was everybody going? Everybody was leaving town.
Back and forth to Charlotte.
To Charlotte or Japan.
Or Japan, yeah, back and forth to Charlotte and Japan. And I think I just started working in for Dino Bravo at the time, going back and forth. On,
Montreal.
Montreal. Because Dino and I were on a couple tours in Japan. And he was in Charlotte when I burned Igor's eye with a cigar.
Remember that.
And it just took off. Well, Inoki was over on one of the tours and saw the reaction, so I did the same thing to Inoki in the Sumo Palace, burned his eye. Almost didn't get home. They sent me home early. And then Bravo was on that tour, so I spent, I think there were $1.25 cigars, cheap cigars, because Boris didn't like to smoke. So I burnt Igor, and I got about 2 years out of that in Charlotte. Burnt Inoki, got 13 years out of that one. And burnt Dino Bravo and got four years out of that in Montreal. For less than $10, I made
3 cigars, yeah.
Yeah.
Talk about the hold that Dusty had by that point on those people in Georgia, because I'd heard about it. Obviously, I'd seen him on TV, seen him a few times live outside the state of Georgia, but I never. Georgia and Florida was his backyard, his people, and I'd never seen that kind of connection. He had those people in the palm of his hand, and they would do anything to lay down their life for him. Talk about some of the fan support to the point of violence at Dusty at that point.
He was sort of a bigger version of Tommy Rich.
Yeah.
You know, he was an impressive specimen physically, but did a serious interview, a little comedy once in a while. But he had charisma. I mean, he had fire. He had it.
Yeah.
And I didn't work that many times with Dusty at all. And I think basically because there was heat between he and Boris was my manager most of the time. And Boris often told him that I was going to hurt him for some reason, which I wouldn't have done. But I always respected his ability to draw fans, and he had charisma. I mean, what more can you say? He drew money and drew people into the building.
When it was, I guess, the fall of 1980, it was a strange period, that fall and winter. The Freebirds came from, they had started in, obviously, working for Nick Goulas and switched over to Jerry Jarrett, went down and made their name in Mid-South, and then they got the chance, and they were synonymous with TBS Channel 17, the Freebirds. I mean, I would drive 20 miles to my friend's house that had cable so we could watch the Freebirds. But at the same time, we went from the sublime to the ridiculous, because at the same time, the Freebirds and Ted DiBiase are getting hot on Georgia TV for whatever reason, and I love you, Poo-Poo, but for whatever reason, they gave Robert Fuller the book. And I don't know whether you were there that much then, but he and Plowboy Frazier were in a program with the Freebirds, and they had the Georgia Tag Team title for a while. Did you ever experience the world of LSD that was Robert Fuller's booking?
No, I was never in a territory that he was booking or actually working at all. I guess that was fortunate on my part.
Well, no, and I say this, and I shouldn't. And Ron, his brother, was actually, I thought, a very good booker and was a very smart businessman, and ended up out of wrestling before too long and a millionaire and owned hockey teams. Robert was a hell of a promo, and still is, hell of a talker. And he had great matches in his youth, and he worked for me in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, but every booking stint that he seemed to have, there was some kind of weirdness going on. And there was a famous story, he took the book in Memphis, and because Robert, of course, was Roy Welch's grandson and Buddy Fuller's son, and the Welches and Fullers were the same family. And he took the book and brought in all his guys from Knoxville, and the houses kept going down, and finally they were down to $12,000 in Memphis, which on a Monday night was like 3,000 people in those days, and that was just unheard of.
Yeah.
And Robert and Jerry Jarrett are standing in the back, and Jerry's got his spit cup, and he says, "Robert, can't get much worse." And Robert said, "Oh, yes, it can." He fired, boom, done. That was Monday night. He fired him. He went back to Knoxville with all his guys after Wednesday night in Evansville, and Jerry Jarrett had 2 days to re-rack the territory and come up with a complete new crew and shoot an angle, and he did the concession stand thing with Lawler and Dundee and the Blonde Bombers and tripled business in 3 weeks. But the same thing happened. It was weird, and it didn't last long, and I guess he was 3 or 4 months. He was gone by the spring of '81. Yeah. Ole took the book back. The Omni was running a couple times a month, maybe every 3 weeks, every once in a while. Gordy and Hayes split up and feuded with each other. DiBiase was still getting over. Flair had a bigger presence. You returned in August, and you beat Tommy Rich to unite the Georgia and national heavyweight titles, because now it wasn't just a Georgia heavyweight, it was the national heavyweight championship, since the program was nationwide. Do you remember in that most of the year that you were gone there, that how the business had changed when you came back?
Not really. Not being there, of course, I didn't have any reference point. I was just glad and comfortable to be back, because I had planned on making Georgia my home. We were in Charlotte, and my wife and I both enjoyed the time we had in Georgia, and then I moved to Georgia, bought a home, and then of course had to go back to Charlotte and live in an apartment, and that wasn't good. So we were happy to be in Georgia, and we thought our next move would have been to Florida. My wife often, we only about a mile from where we live now, about a mile from the North Fulton border. And she still tells me, she says, "I'm not moving any further north than we're at. We'll go south, but we're not going any further north." So, yeah, some of my fondest memories were the time I was in Georgia.
Who pitched the tag team with Super Destroyer, Scott Irwin?
I think Ole had approached us about that. He liked Scott, and Scott was a good performer, hard worker. Willing just to work for the match. Died way, way, way too young.
Was he even 40?
I don't think he was.
Because I never knew him, but I knew his brother Bill.
Yeah.
And
Bill wasn't in there at the time. I had met Bill after that when I was in other territories. But Scott, boy, he was one. I mean, he started that superplex.
Yeah. Oh, that was the big thing.
Yeah.
If we, you would wait, you would watch the TV matches just to get to see the Super Destroyer do the superplex, because that was the biggest bump that had ever been taken.
Goodness.
Nobody could live through that.
He was a strong dude, and I remember he was probably 6'2", 6'3", 300 pounds.
Yeah.
Size 7 shoes.
What?
Size 7 shoes.
No.
Yeah. It looked like he was going to tip over. But what a nice guy. He was a good friend of mine, good friend of my wife, and we knew his wife, and it was just sad when he died. I couldn't get over that. And when I see Bill, I'm happy to see Bill, but I often think of Scott.
Yeah.
So it's just, it's nice and bad at the same time.
At that point in time, 82 in Georgia, some new talent was coming in. Kabuki and Gary Hart, obviously, were hot at the time. Buzz Sawyer had just started. Ole took a liking to him because he was, he was tough. He was crazy, but he was tough. Paul Orndorff.
Yeah.
And Roddy Piper, who had been in the Carolinas for ages, but he pretty much started it, at least before Jesse Ventura, the heel color commentary position.
Yeah. I first met Roddy when he was a heel in California. He was working in Japan. He came over as Captain America or something. He had a cheap Carl Hildegard mask and a Captain America shirt and Rowdy Piper tights and stuff. But he was a feisty guy. He was energetic and good, always on, always happy. And you're right, when he did the interviews, people paid attention.
He started out, he was supposed to be the heel color commentator, which he was, and filled that role, but he was since he wasn't wrestling and really actively screwing around the baby faces, he was just so sharp and so quick and so entertaining that the people started getting behind him, and that's when finally he took up for Gordon Soley, when Gordon was being menaced, and the people all of a sudden, boom, just they took to him. And then I was salivating for it. That's when Lawler was coming down from Memphis, and they were having the battle of the promos, Jerry Lawler and Roddy Piper, with Lawler a heel, which is my favorite role for him. And they're going to have the match, and then Piper, I think, gets fired some way. Ole gets mad at him or whatever, and he went in exile for a while.
I don't know what happened with that, but
and suddenly it was I think Lawler and Bob Armstrong, or what, I don't know. But you also, in addition to teaming with Super Destroyer, you had some matches teaming with one of the legendary names in the business, a guy who everybody said was the worker inside the ring in the 60s, Ray Stevens.
Oh, yeah.
And at the time, he had been in the business, he was teaming with you. At this time, he'd been in the business 30 years and was still on 45. He started as a teenager. Tell me anything about, I'm a mark for Ray Stevens. Tell me anything about Ray Stevens.
It didn't happen in Georgia, but it happened in the Carolinas when he was working with, when I just made my switch from superstar as a heel, Gene and Ole and Snuka came out and kept interfering in my promos. So I made the switch and beat the crap out of both of them and threw Stevens on top of Snuka, and they fell down, and I broke the cane over Gene Henderson. So we're involved in a stipulation match, and we had gone through a number of matches. Well, it led up to a lumberjack match with all his lumberjacks around the ring, and it was a tag match. It was a single between Ray Stevens and myself. Well, Ray was trying to escape and this and that, and he was supposed to jump out of the ring, over the top rope, and on the way down, Ox Baker's supposed to catch him.
Okay.
Well, Ox was preoccupied, so he's taking off, and I'm just lunging, and I see Ray, and he didn't hit the ropes or anything. He went, oh! And Ox hadn't even turned around, and he landed right behind Ox, and his both legs split, and he tore all the muscles in his groin.
Oh, Jesus.
Oh. If he could have gotten up, which he couldn't, he probably would have beat the crap out of Ox Baker. But yeah, that was a painful. So that put a little kibosh on our program. It was like 6 or 8 weeks that he was out. And then another time, I'm in Georgia, and Ray comes in. And Ole was sort of trying to give him a favor and trying to give him a little piecemeal here and there. And we found a little apartment for Ray. And he had a travel trailer and a truck, pickup truck. So one day we get to the office and there's no Ray. Don't hear from him. About 9 months later, we get a phone call. Bill, Ray? Yeah, how you been? Great, where you at? He said, do you remember where I parked my truck? I said, no, Ray, I don't. So she says, okay, thanks. He hung up.
Well, that's Bobby Heenan's favorite story from the AWA. Was Stevens was up there, he met a girl and he got married.
Took off.
And yeah, when he gave notice to the territory, it's time for him to leave, he told everybody he was leaving except her. He comes back after a year and a half and finds out she's divorced him. He's like, honey, why? She didn't know he was alive or dead. You couldn't find people in those days.
Yeah.
I got to ride with him one night and just listen to flight canceled. And I said, I'll drive, instead of Charlotte, we went to Atlanta, right? Mm-hmm. And I said, I'll drive us if you'll just ride with me, right? Okay.
Tell stories.
Yeah, and he, making $150,000 a year in San Francisco in 1962 with a house on the beach, and a boat and a motorcycle and a car, and married 6 times to 5 different women, and he had more fun than any human being should be allowed to have, and wouldn't have traded any of it for.
And for years and years and years, every time I saw Flair take that upside down bump, I would see Ray Stevens.
It's an homage.
Because he took it from Ray.
But he never got it right. I mean, I love the Nage, but he never got it right. And Michaels just looked like a Olympic gymnast doing it.
Yeah.
It's so pretty, but it didn't hurt anybody. But Stevens would launch himself. Oh yeah, you grab that wrist, and as the guy let go, he was going so, you wouldn't believe you could get up that much speed in 18 feet. And then suddenly upside down and just hit it. And boom. The variation I've heard is when he'd go upside down and he'd hit and he'd sit up and he'd hit his head on the post, he'd have the blade in his hand, he'd get the juice on the way back down, and he'd have the blade back in his mouth by the time he hit the ring.
And I admit, I took one of his bumps because the guy would get me going, and I'd take a punch or this and that, and I'd spin around, and I'd be 2 or 3 feet from the rope, and I'd choke myself over the top rope and take the bump backwards. And Ray used to do that all the time. I said, that's a neat move. I'm going to use that, Ray. Go ahead. He says, everybody else takes for
Go ahead. Here, have a sandwich while you're at it. In July 4th, 1982, back to the Omni. You imagine this, you beat Wrestling 2 again. Underneath the main event, which was Flair and Backlund, NWA versus WWF Championship, which once again was, it happened in Florida a couple times because of Eddie Graham, who he was.
And those never meant anything. When they brought Bruno down, they never meant anything.
That's the thing. That's what I was going to ask you is how did you feel the fans react to it, and how did you think the boys reacted to it? Because it was such a special match. It was surprising, shocking. It would never happen. Like I said, Eddie Graham could get one done in his big Florida towns every once in a while. I think they had one in St. Louis with Harley and Backlund, couple in the Omni, but for something that would appear to be the dream match of the era, you don't hear them drawing record gates. Did people not care about the other titles down there? Were they smart enough to know that nothing was going to change? It was always a double
I don't know
Zabada?
about that, but I know that when they brought in other area champions, the people really didn't. I think they were cordial. They would watch the match, but they wouldn't get excited because they probably knew they weren't going to see him again for a couple years.
Yeah.
They didn't mean anything to him. Bruno used to come down there, and when I grew up in Pittsburgh, and Bruno was it.
Yeah.
But when they came down there, Bruno was just some guy with a belt from up north.
Well, I remember I learned a lesson in 1979 in Lexington, Kentucky. Jarrett had opened up Rupp Arena, which at the time was the biggest arena in the South. Of course, they curtained down half of it, but in a city the size of Lexington, the only reason they built that arena was because of the University of Kentucky basketball. And nothing else could fill it, even the Rolling Stones. So wrestling would go in first Thursday of every month, and Jarrett tried to make that for a while the big card, even above Memphis. And one month was a double main event. Nick Bockwinkel versus Bill Dundee for the AWA title, and Jerry Lawler versus superstar Billy Graham for the CWA title that they had created to give Lawler a world title. That drew 6,000 people. 2 world title matches with superstar Billy Graham and Nick Bockwinkel. The next month, 1 title match, Lawler's belt he just won from superstar Billy Graham against the fabulous Jackie Fargo.
Oh, yeah.
The people get the chance, first time in 5 years, to see Lawler and Fargo, legendary match. 8,000 people, 2,000 extra people with no Graham and Bockwinkel, just throw Fargo in there. They want to see what's over with them. That was the beauty of territorial wrestling.
Yeah, what's local?
You know, people everywhere don't like Chinese food. People everywhere don't. They want a certain thing that they like, that they're accustomed to. That was the beauty of educating the fan base in those days to the product that the promoter was best at presenting, and that the talent that he knew and had good relationship with was best at performing. That's what you, whether it was bloody fights in Texas, or the bench clearing brawls in Memphis, or amateur wrestling with a little Zabada thrown in Florida, or the big ex-jocks in Minnesota. The fans bought that, and the promoters didn't care whether fans in another area cared about their shit, because they weren't buying the tickets.
It's sort of like nationalism.
This is ours.
You're American, and you're Chinese, and you're French, and I'm Southern, and you're not.
Yeah.
It's just, I think that's the downfall of now. You can't take the same match from New York City to Salt Lake or to Phoenix.
Yeah.
You got to add a little local flavor to it. But we're not in that situation right now. But you're absolutely true. I mean, they would like to see the one guy that did make a difference of all the champions you mentioned, and was accepted because he was there a lot, was Bockwinkel.
Yeah.
When Bockwinkel came into Georgia, he meant a little bit more, a lot more than the New York champ or the
And he had been a
Midwest
top
champ.
guy there back in the late 60s, early 70s, but it's also because Nick could work any style. He wasn't pigeonholed. I think they cared more about Nick personally than they did the belt he was carrying, which was an outside belt that they didn't.
Yeah. He had good matches with everybody.
Christmas night was another, once again, where have all the Christmases gone? Christmas night, Thanksgiving and Christmas, both were the biggest nights of the year for wrestling, live wrestling.
Thanksgiving was the biggest of the year. You wanted to make sure that you had a good program going there. Christmas night, and then Christmas week, and then New Year's.
Yep.
Those were the money makers. And
that made your holiday.
You can't be home. If you're home, something's wrong.
I had 2 Christmases off between 1982 and 1995. And that wasn't on purpose. It's just because I was in between things I was doing.
Well, we used to celebrate Christmas on the 24th because my wife knew I wasn't going to be home from the 25th till the day after New Year's.
A lot of times you do double. The Carolinas would do the double shot. You go Greenville, Charlotte, or then later Greenville, Atlanta. But in 82, the main event was you, Super Destroyer, and Kabuki against Stan Hansen, Tito Santana, and Andre the Giant. Stacked up card, 13,000 fans. And at the start of 83, you were in and out for most of that year, back and forth to Japan, a few things. And while business up north, Michigan, Ohio, West Virginia, etc., we talked about off cable, was still staying strong, the state of Georgia was starting to suffer. Did you start to see whether it was just not only having to run the Omni, which was more expensive, and having to probably the payoffs went down because expenses were up, but that's what part of the Briscoes' problem was. Jack and Jerry were realizing, hey, our dividend checks are going down, and the northern tours were still doing well, but the state of Georgia, they had kind of almost abandoned in some case, because it was June of 83 that Ole made the deal to bring a bunch of us job guys down to run his Georgia towns, because he was so concentrated on the northern tour.
Everything was reversed. I mean, we were spending more time up north, and I often thought that, why don't you do 2 and 2? Or 1 or 10 days up there and the rest
week
down
and a
here.
week, or 2 weeks, 2 weeks, or something.
You're absolutely right. They were bringing in other guys, and I know at that time I was going back and forth to Japan 14, 15 weeks a year, so I'd be there for a couple weeks and gone, and a couple weeks and gone. But they were emphasizing the northern, because we were making more money up there.
Yeah.
And
well, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Was it a self-fulfilling prophecy? Because one Omni might draw 3,000 people, the next one draw 9,000 people, depending on the attraction. Summer of '83, of course, remembered fondly as the debut of the Road Warriors, which made a huge splash on television. And once again, the northern towns, but a lot of people don't remember that they still didn't draw in Georgia.
yeah,
If a tree with spikes and face paint falls in an empty forest, I wrote this down. But what was the time frame when Ole booted Barnett, and what do you know about it?
there was a bunch of rumors. I remember Mosca and Stan and myself and Ole would be asked to come to meetings and this and that. And I think I was in Japan when it actually took place. But there again, I think it would have coexisted with Barnett being there,
Yeah.
because he wasn't going to stand in the way of making money. But
What I heard, and I think we were like I said, I was not going to ask anybody any question except what do you want me to do and when do I need to be there at that point. But we were down there in the summertime, and the way that I had heard it is that Ole had come in late at night and gone through the facts and figures in the books or whatever, and seen that Jim was taking because some of the partners were upset about their checks. Jim had taken some of the money and done whatever, and he was in Hong Kong at the time having his new wardrobe done. But the point was made that when business had been bad in the past, Jim had put his money into it so why couldn't he take some or whatever? Point is, he said, she said, and truth somewhere in the middle, but Ole, with the support of the other stockholders, was able to force Barnett out. That's when Jim, because one thing you didn't do is force Jim Barnett out of obviously, he's the one that the NWA had come back to win the war to begin with.
Yeah.
He immediately calls Vince, and
Yeah.
he's working for Vince McMahon as his consultant
Right.
within weeks. And
probably days.
And Ole had made an enemy, and it would come back to bite him about not even a year later, because spring 1984, you were back. You and Bundy at the Omni beat the Road Warriors for the national tag team title. Then 2 weeks later, there was a tournament for the belts, and the Warriors won it back because you had to go back to Japan probably.
Yeah.
But the roster still had a lot of names at that point, but not like the past. The houses were down, so they weren't bringing in as many fly-ins, and then because they didn't have as many stars and the fans were jaded and spoiled, they were staying away. Was it?
I don't really recall that period of time too much because I was going back. I was going into Japan. I was going in up into Montreal, going in and out for Watts. But I had my base in Georgia, so I probably wanted it to last forever.
Yeah.
But you could see the writing on the wall. There was different faces there. And some of the guys didn't like what Ole was always good to me. He always paid me what he told me he was going to do. Gave me the time off when I wanted it. I just asked him. He threw a couple fits about me at the beginning, but he realized, I'm not going to be able to stay here a long time.
If Ole didn't throw a fit about you, I don't think he liked you.
Yeah, that's right.
And I've come to appreciate his crustiness after all these years, especially when, as he told me one time, and I repeat this all the time, he said, Cornette, I used to think you were a dumb fuck, but so many other dumb fucks have come along that are worse than you. You moved up the ladder without doing anything.
That's it.
But the point is, he'd made an enemy, and July 14th, 1984 was Black Saturday. Jim Barnett had convinced the Briscoe brothers basically it was the story that Jack and Jerry tell, and I believe them, was that they were calling Vince to find out about Roddy Piper's health because he was up there then and they'd heard he got injured. But the point was that Jim Barnett had gone to work for Vince McMahon, and he told Vince exactly what was going on in the Georgia office, who owned what, how you could get majority interest, that national TV spot, they're fucking it up, Vince.
Yeah.
And so Barnett convinced the Briscoes to sell their shares to Vince McMahon along with his and along with Paul Jones's, who was in ill health at the time and was just anxious to get out of it. All of a sudden, Ole Anderson has 10% of nothing because they owned the majority interest in the company and they could do what they wanted. And suddenly one day, people tune in Georgia Championship Wrestling on Channel 17, and there's Freddie Miller introducing Vince McMahon Jr., who says, we got a great new program for you that you're going to see and you're going to love.
And they had offered Ole a job, I know, on 2 or 3 occasions, but he turned them down.
Yeah,
You know,
and that
irascible.
that offer was not extended anymore after that.
No. But I think, you know, that was a big turning point. It was a big adjustment for the fans in Georgia. I know a lot of the people comment when I talk to them about the past. And they remember that day like it was just yesterday.
Yeah.
And that was like one of your family members died.
Well, it was like all of a sudden you tuned in to see Gunsmoke and there was a new sheriff.
Yeah, that's right.
I can't even, it's a dated reference. Well, fuck, I'm old. I can't express people today, they see wrestling change every 2 weeks. And there's people all over the place and there's no real shocking thing anymore. But this was the most shocking thing that had ever happened on mainstream wrestling television. All of a sudden, and the fans did the closest thing to riot that fans do when they're calling from home. They're writing letters, they're calling the station in droves. Where's our Gordon Soley wrestling? What is this shit? Because the WWF style didn't fly in Georgia.
No.
And they were showing clips from the Boston Garden or Madison Square Garden or whatever. It wasn't a studio show. There was no Gordon Soley.
Yeah.
They didn't like the style. They knew some of the names, but it just didn't work. And Turner had been told by Vince that he was going to get a studio show just with a different promotion. And all of a sudden he's not, and then Vince made a half-hearted attempt at it, but that's when he relinquished and gave Ole an early Saturday morning slot. And then because he'd known Watts from years ago, he put Mid-South Wrestling on Sunday afternoon. So now on one station in Atlanta for a brief period of time, maybe 6 months, you had Georgia Wrestling, the new company that Ole formed, on Saturday morning, 2 hours of WWF on Saturday night, and Mid-South Wrestling on Sunday afternoon. And Mid-South Wrestling, that had never been seen nationally, was beating them all in the ratings.
Yeah.
And that's when Watts was going to go in partnership with Turner when Jimmy Crockett appeared. Do you remember, where were you when you heard that Crockett had bought the time slot? I was in Dallas because I was watching.
I was probably overseas, to be honest with you. That era for me was just a blur. You're absolutely right. The fans and some of the boys had no idea what was going on.
Yeah.
You couldn't keep this story or that story, or where are they going or what are they doing? And it's just blurry.
Turner was going to force Vince off the station because he didn't like the program and it wasn't performing and it was not what he was in the business for, because Vince had bought the company, but the company was not really guaranteed the time slot unless it performed.
Right.
So
they needed Turner.
Barnett once again brokers the deal. He said, well, Jimmy Crockett will take it. So Barnett arranges for Crockett to pay Vince $1 million in very early 1985, which Vince turns around and finances WrestleMania 1 with, that he had overextended himself. And what was the comment? You'll choke on that $1 million. And it took about, let's say 85, it took about 3 or 4 years, but he choked on it.
Yeah, it's, and everybody thinks they've got the golden secret for everything. You have to wade through this. You know, Crockett's, I think, probably thought they were going to take off and just take over the whole Georgia territory. And they had to step up because they had a lot of guys that were familiar faces to the fans. But, you know, like, you're right, Watts did real well with that.
I remember, and I will say that at the end of '84, right before Crockett bought the time slot, just off that early morning show, Ole was still trying to run the Omni, and the Omni at the end of the year, last show in December of 1984, was down to 1,000 people.
Oh, my
so
God.
you had a town that had been the hotbed of wrestling that was drawing, when the Omni ran once and the City Auditorium ran 3 times, maybe 40,000 paid admissions per month, it was down to 1,000 people. And I remember when we started working for Crockett and going into the Omni, and I'd waited so many years to work the Omni, and I went in, and there was 8,000 people, or there was 9,000, or sometimes 7, and every once in a while a Starcade or whatever, it would be a near sellout, but we never turned them away, never really filled everything up, and the people, it didn't have the feel that I remembered when I had gone to see the matches there. They felt like their feelings had been hurt, and they just couldn't get all the way into it anymore.
When it was going at the hottest, if you went in and it wasn't at least over 3/4 full,
yeah,
Barnett was upset and somebody was going to get fired.
Well, as we've seen, when Jim Barnett gets upset, shit takes place.
And you just took for granted. I mean, you build it up for 3 weeks, you're going in there and it's going to blow off.
Yeah.
To see, I never saw it at 1,000, thank God. I would have been really disappointed.
Oh God, well, you should. When Turner Broadcasting finally ended up with the whole thing, you've seen it at less than 1,000. You could shoot deer in the balcony.
Oh my God.
It was brutal, but that in one way it was the death of one of the classic wrestling territories, and in another way, it was the start of the only war maybe that ever beat the war of 72 to 74, the Monday Night Wars, because what formed Atlanta wrestling really there was 3 different generations. There was the old Atlanta wrestling, there was the Georgia Championship Wrestling heyday between 74 and 84, and then there was the Crockett years and the Monday Night Wars that followed in WCW. So Atlanta, if it hadn't been for the city of Atlanta, wrestling history would have been significantly different. And
very, very much changed, yeah. And it's sad. I mean, it's sad that the WCW never took off and sustained like it should have. You got Channel 17, for God's sake.
They had all the tools. They had all the tools. It was the loose nut behind the wheel that caused the whole thing to fall apart.
Sad. You're making me depressed, Mike.
Has anybody got any Kleenex? I feel so bad. But what are your final thoughts, final memories on Georgia Championship Wrestling?
Well, like I said, I think my fondest memories of being in this business were in Georgia. Made a lot of good friends. I still have. I still live there. The towns, I can picture the towns. We talked about these individuals, and I can see the guys in the ring. I can see how frantic the fans were. Yeah. You know, fanatic fans.
Yeah.
The buildings overflowing, just the excitement. And it was a good time. It was a good time in my life.
Well, this was a good time here, Bill. I want to thank you very much. Don't put the Cobra on me, please.
No.
Bill Eadie, the Masked Superstar, Bolo Mongol, Demolition, whatever the case, you change your names regularly to stay ahead of the law, but we thank you for being a part of Back to the Territories. We thank you for being a part of Back to the Territories, and we will see you once again very soon when we go to another far-flung territory, revisit the days of the past in professional wrestling. For Kayfabe Commentaries, I'm Jim Cornette. We'll see you later.